Alright guys, so this is my cheap Ancheer e-bike that I got from Amazon for about $600 delivered to my door. I've put over 1,000 miles on this thing so far. And even though this thing doesn't have an odometer, in fact it barely has a screen at all, it's very basic, but I've been keeping track of it and I want to give you guys an update on how this thing has lasted me over the past 1,000 miles. And if you should buy one too. Alright guys, so let's go ahead, put on the GoPro and go out and take this thing for a ride and talk a little bit about it. Guys, so we're out here riding the Ancheer bike around, and this is how I usually ride this thing, just on bike paths. I don't like riding on the street. Sometimes I'll take it off road. Maybe I'll go find a trail up here in a little bit and show you guys. But this thing is awesome. This is great for especially paved paths, roads, stuff like that. I'm really impressed with how this thing performs. So on this bike, we're dealing with a 36 volt, 10.4 amp hour battery, 350 watt hub motor in the rear. And it's nothing crazy, honestly, but it gets the job done. I like this a lot. This thing has about a top speed of 21 on a fresh battery, but typically when I'm out, I get about 18 or 19 miles per hour. I weigh about 150 pounds and I'm 5'9", and I fit on this bike really well. But if you're any bigger or any heavier, you might want to look for something a little bit more powerful and bigger. A lot of people are probably curious what kind of gears are on this thing and the Shimano shifters and all that. Look, I don't really ride this bike like that. I ride this bike like a moped. I don't really shift the gears or anything, but they're good for what they are. I mean, this is basically a big box store bike with an electric hub motor on it. One thing I will say is I'm going about 20 miles an hour right now, and in top gear, like pedaling, like nothing's happening. I'm not doing anything. So I mean, you really run out of gears at the top end, so you know, you're not gonna be pedaling 20 miles an hour on this thing. You can probably pedal up to 15 miles an hour and that's it. So probably the biggest thing that I like about this bike is just the value that you get. You know, it's pretty crazy to think that you get an entire bike for $400 or $500 that's electric, they can go 20 miles an hour. Like it's such a good value for what you get. And of course the parts are cheap and everything on here, and I'll get into that later, but you know, this thing costs as much as a lot of conversion kits for e-bikes. So really, I think you can't beat it for that. You know, for $400 or $500 a pop, you could get 2 or 3 of these things and have a bike for the whole family, and you guys can go out on the trail like this and ride around. Like, it's just awesome. The other thing that I really like about this bike is it has kind of a stealthy design to it. Like, since it's a mountain bike design, it's not really too obvious. You know, a lot of e-bikes now look like e-bikes. You know, they kind of look like mini mopeds or something. But this is pretty subtle. And honestly, if you didn't see the battery down here in the frame, you probably wouldn't know it's an e-bike. Another great thing about this bike is I regularly get 20 miles of range out of just throttle only on this thing. If I pedaled, I could probably get 30 to 40 miles of range, depending on how high my assist level was. Now, like I said, I don't really pedal this thing, I just use throttle only most of the time. But it's cool that it gets so much range even on throttle only mode. A lot of people who ride bikes to work, they're probably not on a 20-mile commute. So theoretically, you could ride this thing, you know, 5, 10, 15 miles, go to work, charge this thing up while you're working, and then ride back home. I mean, if your commute's only 5 or 10 miles, you could easily not even charge this thing and make it round trip. All right, so the things that I don't really like about this bike. Now look, there's nothing really that major that I don't like about this bike. Honestly, it's more nitpicking, but I will say probably the biggest thing about this bike was I had issues with the front brakes. And that actually was a pretty big issue. It was nothing that ever put me in danger or anything. Basically, I had to adjust them a lot, and then when I was going to replace the pads, the magnet that held the brake pad in actually came off, so the front caliper basically broke. I mean, I probably could have fixed it somehow, but I figured it was worth it to get a better quality one. You know, the thing about the brakes on this bike is they're basically just mountain bike brakes for a regular mountain bike. They're not really made to be stopping from like 20 plus miles an hour constantly. And so I think the brakes, you know, they just couldn't handle really what this thing was made to do. Oh, and the back brake likes to squeak too. Yeah, it's pretty loud, pretty annoying. But so anyways, I changed out the front caliper and replaced the cable and everything, and now it's really good. It stops even better than the other ones. Bigger pads, better pads. The front brake is basically completely quiet. The rear brake is still stock, and like I said, that makes some noise. But I mean, it is what it is. So if you do buy this bike, I would probably replace the front brake if you're going to be riding it a lot. Other than that, brakes are pretty good for what they are on this bike. So another thing was the stock saddle on this bike really wasn't that comfortable. It was okay for like maybe 10, 15 miles, but if you're going to be going on long rides on this bike, you're going to want to buy a better seat. And you can easily buy those on Amazon or at Walmart or something. And again, for the price, I can't stress this enough. For the price, the seat's not bad. Like, it is what it is. They make a decent bike, and they have to skip and cut costs in some places, so I understand. Big bump. So yeah, that's another thing, I guess, since we just went over that big bump, is I wish this was a rear suspension bike. This is a front suspension bike only. And it would be nice to have that extra dampening in the back, but I mean, front shock, it does okay, and you know, this is more of a road bike anyways, so you're not really gonna be going over huge bumps. It didn't really come with a good headlight, and it didn't come with any tail light. Yeah, if you buy the new one, it looks like it comes with a built-in headlight, which is nice, but it's something that I wish this bike would have came with. And on an e-bike, to me, that's kind of standard nowadays. That's kind of the bare minimum. LEDs are pretty cheap, and it's not that expensive to wire one into your bike from the manufacturer. So some of my other kind of neutral comments about this bike is it is cheap parts. Like, the frame and everything seems good. Everything seems pretty solid on this bike. I've ridden this thing again over, at this point, probably over 1,200 miles. And everything is still really solid. There's no real like weird rattles or anything on this bike. It's kind of well built for what it is. But you know, there's a lot of plastic, there's a lot of cheap parts on this thing. And that's just how you get a bike at a $400 or $500 price point like this. You know, I haven't exactly been kind to this bike. I take it off-road a decent amount, and I take it over some big bumps and on some rough trails and everything. But it's held up nice, and there's no cracks. There's no, you know, I don't really feel unsafe on this bike. I don't know if I'd want to go more than like 20, 25 on this thing, but you know, it does okay. But the actual whole top of this fork is plastic. And yeah, that kind of concerns me a little bit if I was heavier. But we're gonna go on this little off-road trail here. I want to show you guys how this thing does off-road. I'm just using throttle only here, and I mean, this thing is going, and you can see this thing just, it takes a second, it gets there, but once it builds momentum, like, I can get up this hill no problem. And we're just cruising. Now, I'm not even on a full battery either. It's indicating 1 bar right now, but it's taking me up this hill completely on its own. No pedal assist. Now we'll go downhill here. This part gets kind of rough. Ooh. Oh man, that's rough. Oh. Yeah, now we're back out on some grass. Man, getting shaken around here. Some rear suspension would be nice. Oh, we're back on smooth road. That's nice. Yeah, another thing that I would say about this bike is the battery. The battery is good. I've never had an issue with it. I've put a lot of charge cycles on this thing, and I actually bought 2 batteries, so I have 2 to extend my range. But the battery that this comes with, I couldn't find anything about what types of cells that they use on this thing. So I'm just gonna assume that they're generic. And look, 99% of the time you'll be fine, but it would be nice to have Samsung cells or LG cells or something with a name brand. But for this cheap price point, I don't blame them. They probably wouldn't be able to make a bike possible. Honestly, a bike with a battery with LG cells or Samsung cells would probably cost as much as this whole bike does. So it makes sense that they had to use generic cells in this thing, because otherwise they just wouldn't be able to get it to this price point. And so really what that means is, you know, you really shouldn't be worried. Like, you're probably gonna be fine, but just be careful when you're charging this thing, when you're using it. You know, when you charge it, make sure it's supervised. Like, I've never had any issues with overheating. I always use the same charger that it came with, but I guess you just never know. What else? This is actually the second battery that I bought. This is one with generic cells. Like, again, if you're gonna buy a good quality battery, it's probably gonna cost as much as the entire bike does. If you just want something to introduce you to, you know, the world of e-bikes, I guess, this is a great introduction. If you're not sure, or if you just want something cheap, this is amazing. But I would really ask yourself, if I'm going to put some money into this bike, if I'm going to upgrade it, would I be better off buying a better bike with those parts already on it? You know, is it really worth replacing the brakes? Is it really worth buying fenders for this bike? Is it worth replacing the front forks? At that point, you know, you're probably going to be $800 to $1,000 in this thing. And look, it's a good frame and everything, and, you know, a good battery, good motor. But that's just a question to consider if you're going to be buying this thing. Can I get something better for the amount of money that I'm going to put into this thing? It's a cheap upfront cost, but, you know, you might have to sink a little bit of money into this thing, although it's not completely necessary to do so. All right, guys, so let's hop back on here and head out. So really, this bike is almost a disposable bike. You know, it's kind of like, if something breaks on this bike, is it really worth it to buy a new part, or is it better off? Are you better off just buying a whole new bike? Like I said, a new battery on this thing is half the cost of this bike. Like, if the battery went out, is it better to just buy a whole new bike? I don't know. That's up to you. That's up to your budget. This bike really is so much fun, just hopping on the road like this and riding around. I could definitely see somebody riding this thing to work or to school or something like that. Just my final thoughts on this bike, I guess, after 1,200 plus miles, is that this is probably the best purchase I've made in a long time. I've had so much fun on this bike. I bought this thing in February, and I live in Illinois, and it gets cold here in the winter. I was riding this thing when it was like 40 degrees outside. I had like a North Face on, a sweater, like I was outside in 40-degree weather riding this thing because I was so excited to ride it. And when the weather's nice like this, it's even better. I was still having fun on the trail when it was cold out. But anyways, this has just been the best money that I've spent and some of the most fun that I've had in a long time. Just the ability for me to go out and adventure and explore and go anywhere that I can see, basically. You know, there's not many places that this bike can't go. You can go on trails, you can go on gravel trails, you can go on, you know, trails like this, you can go on the road. You could use this thing as a vehicle. You could use this thing for fun like I do. There's just so many possibilities with this thing, and it's held up so well that I think for $400 or $500, this thing's a no-brainer. You know, if you have the money, or even if you're in need of cheap transportation, like, this beats taking the bus by a million times. I would rather drive this thing in the snow than I would take the bus. So, you know, this thing is just, it's very impressive. I was not expecting to like it as much as I do, and I really can't recommend this thing enough. If you really want to get into the world of e-bikes, then I would recommend this thing. If you're somebody who knows about e-bikes, then you probably have something better than this, and you're not going to watch this video anyways. So I would say go for it. Hop on this thing, $400 or $500 on Amazon, shipped to your door. Assembly is pretty straightforward, and I can't recommend this thing enough. And if you guys are interested in this bike, I'll leave a link in the description below that you can go ahead and pick this thing up at the best price. And it's actually the updated version, so you do get that headlight and everything. So go check out that link in the description, guys, if you want to pick up the new updated version of this bike.